You know what got me started down this rabbit hole? I was helping a friend salvage some oak beams from a barn in eastern Pennsylvania. The barn was built sometime around 1840, and when we pulled those beams out, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. The grain was so tight and uniform, it almost looked fake. I'm talking maybe 20 growth rings packed into a single inch. I took a piece home and compared it to a piece of white oak I'd just picked up from the lumber yard, and it wasn't even close. The new stuff looked coarse and open by comparison. So I started digging into why old timber looks and performs so differently from what we buy today. And what I found took me all the way back to medieval England. It turns out kings and queens once controlled entire forests under penalty of law, and the methods they used to manage those trees produced some of the finest building timber the world has ever seen. Today I'm going to walk you through 5 of those forest management techniques, methods that were once enforced so strictly that a commoner could lose a hand for violating them. And stick around to the end, because I'll show you how to read the grain on a board to tell whether the tree it came from was slow-grown the old way or fast-grown the modern way. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about here is a system of forestry that treated trees not as a crop to be harvested all at once, but as a living resource to be managed across generations. These methods kept royal navies afloat, cathedral roofs standing, and villages supplied with fuel and fencing for centuries. And the wood they produced was genuinely superior to almost anything you'll find at a modern lumberyard. Understanding why gives you a completely different eye for selecting lumber today. So let me give you some background, because this isn't just about trees. It's about power, law, and a way of thinking about wood that we've almost completely lost. Starting in the 11th century, English kings began designating vast stretches of woodland as royal forests. William the Conqueror established the New Forest in 1066, right after the Norman Conquest, and over the following centuries, the Crown claimed control over dozens more. The Forest of Dean, Sherwood, Epping, these weren't just hunting grounds, they were strategic timber reserves. The Crown needed a continuous supply of oak for warships, for castle construction, for cathedral roof frames that had to span 60 or 70 feet without a single internal support. And they couldn't afford to run out. So they developed and enforced a set of forest management laws that were, frankly, brutal. Under the Forest Charter of 1217, which most people have never heard of even though it was issued alongside the Magna Carta, specific rules governed who could cut what, when, and how. Commoners could gather deadfall and small wood for fuel, a right called estover, but touching a living tree of any significant size without authorization was a serious crime. Penalties ranged from heavy fines to imprisonment, and in earlier periods, mutilation. These weren't suggestions. They were enforced by a network of forest wardens, verderers, and royal courts that operated for hundreds of years. Now, you might think this was just about hoarding resources, but the methods behind the restrictions were genuinely brilliant. The Crown wasn't just protecting trees. They were shaping them, managing growth cycles, and producing timber with specific structural properties that you simply cannot get from a tree that's been left alone or grown on a modern plantation. Let me show you what they actually did. The first method is coppicing, and once you understand it, you'll never look at a woodlot the same way. Coppicing is the practice of cutting a broadleaf tree down to a low stump, usually just a few inches above the ground, and then letting it regrow from the root system. When you do this to species, like hazel, sweet chestnut, ash, or oak, the stump doesn't die. It sends up a cluster of new shoots, sometimes a dozen or more, and those shoots grow straight and fast because they're powered by the full established root system of the original tree. Within 7 to 10 years for something like hazel, or 20 to 25 years for oak, you've got a fresh harvest of straight uniform poles and small timber. And then you cut it again, and the cycle repeats. Some coppice stools in England have been documented at over 1,000 years old, still producing wood. The medieval foresters would divide a forest into sections and rotate through them on a set schedule, so every year a different section was ready for harvest. It was essentially a perpetual wood factory. The timber that comes from coppiced trees is remarkably straight-grained and consistent, because the shoots grow rapidly and evenly toward the light. For a woodworker, that means fewer knots, less wild grain, and more predictable behavior when you're cutting joints or planing surfaces. It's the kind of stock you dream about finding. The second method is pollarding, and this is the one that really connects to shipbuilding and large-scale construction. Pollarding is similar to coppicing, but instead of cutting the tree at ground level, you cut it at 8 to 12 feet above the ground. The reason is simple and practical. In areas where livestock grazed or deer roamed, New shoots growing from a ground-level stump would get eaten before they had a chance to mature. By cutting higher up, the regrowth was out of reach of animals. But here's where it gets fascinating for woodworkers. When a pollarded oak sends out new limbs from that high cut point, those limbs grow outward at angles before curving upward toward the light. Over decades, this produces naturally curved timber, the exact shapes that shipbuilders and cathedral framers needed for knees, braces, and ribs. You have to understand, in an age, before steam bending and lamination, the only way to get a strong curved structural member was to find a tree that grew in that shape naturally. The grain would follow the curve, which meant the strength followed the curve. A curved piece sawn from a straight log has cross grain that makes it weak at the bend. But a naturally curved pollard branch is continuous grain all the way through. The English Navy depended on this. The Forest of Dean was specifically managed to produce compass timber, which is what they called these curved pieces, for warship construction. Every great oak in those forests was essentially being sculpted over generations to produce specific shapes. When I first learned that, it completely changed how I think about grain direction in my own projects. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called the Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking, the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third method is what I call the royal selection harvest, though the medieval foresters had their own terms for it. Unlike modern clear-cutting, where every tree in a section comes down at once, the Crown's foresters practiced an extremely selective approach. They would walk through a stand and mark individual trees for harvest based on specific criteria: the size of the trunk, the character of the grain, the shape of the branching, and, critically, what the timber was needed for. A tree destined for a ship's keel had to be straight and massive, often 3 feet or more in diameter. A tree for a cathedral brace needed that natural curve I just mentioned. A tree for barrel staves needed to be straight-grained oak with minimal knots. They weren't just cutting trees. They were matching individual trees to individual purposes, sometimes decades in advance. A forester might mark a young oak as a future keel timber and protect it for 80 or 100 years until it reached the right size. The surrounding trees were left standing, which meant the forest canopy stayed intact, the soil stayed stable, and the remaining trees continued to grow slowly and develop dense, tight grain. This is the exact opposite of how plantation forestry works today, where you plant a monoculture, grow it as fast as possible, and clear-cut the whole thing in 20 to 40 years. The fourth method is something modern forestry barely considers at all, and that's deliberately aging trees on the stump, far beyond what we'd consider commercially optimal. Today, a plantation oak might be harvested at 40 to 60 years. It's big enough to mill into lumber, and the economics say cut it now and plant another one. But medieval foresters routinely let oaks stand for 150 to 300 years before harvest. And here's why that matters to anyone who works with wood. A tree that grows slowly under a closed forest canopy develops incredibly dense wood. The annual growth rings are thin and tightly packed, which means more wood fiber per inch and fewer of the large open pores you see in fast-grown timber. When I looked at those old barn beams from 1840, that's exactly what I was seeing. Wood from trees that had been growing for well over a century before anyone touched them. Dense, tight, heavy, and dimensionally stable in ways that modern lumber simply cannot match. This old growth character also affects workability. When you plane a piece of slow-grown oak, the surface comes out smoother because the grain is more uniform. It holds joinery tighter because it doesn't compress as easily under load, and it resists decay better because the dense cell structure leaves less room for moisture and fungi to penetrate. Medieval builders knew this from experience. We now have the science to explain exactly why they were right. The fifth method involves active management of the forest understory and floor, something that sounds more like gardening than forestry, but had a huge impact on timber quality. Royal foresters didn't just manage the trees, they managed everything around and beneath the trees. Undergrowth was periodically cleared, sometimes by controlled grazing with pigs, which also cleared fallen mass like acorns and beechnuts. Certain species were encouraged in the understory while others were removed. The goal was to maintain a forest structure where the canopy trees had enough space and light to grow healthy crowns, but enough competition to keep their growth slow and steady. This controlled environment meant fewer low branches on the main timber trees, which in turn meant fewer knots in the harvested lumber. A tree that grows in an open field throws out branches all the way down its trunk. A tree that grows in a managed forest self-prunes its lower limbs because they're shaded out, producing a long, clean, knot-free bole that's ideal for conversion into structural timber or fine woodworking stock. Every piece of clear, knot-free, old-growth lumber you've ever admired at an antique shop or salvage yard almost certainly came from a tree that grew in exactly these conditions. Let me share some patterns I've noticed that connect all of this to how most of us buy and use wood today. No judgment here because I've done every one of these things myself for decades. The first pattern is buying lumber purely by dimension and price without thinking about how the tree was grown. Most of us walk into a lumber yard, find the thickness and species we need, and pick the straightest boards we can find. But the medieval foresters would have looked at that same board and immediately known whether the tree grew fast or slow in the open or under canopy and what it was suited for. Once you start reading the growth rings and grain character, you can make the same kind of assessment. The second pattern is assuming all oak is the same. I used to think white oak was white oak. But there's an enormous difference between a white oak that grew on a modern plantation in 40 years and one that grew in a managed forest over 200 years. The density, the workability, the stability, they're different animals. Seeking out slow-grown stock, even if it costs more, makes a real difference in the finished piece. The third pattern is ignoring grain direction in curved or angled components. Most of us will saw a curved bracket out of a straight board because that's what we have. The medieval shipwrights would have been horrified by that because they understood that cross-grain in a curve is a structural weakness waiting to fail. They'd find or grow a piece with naturally curved grain instead. The fourth pattern is treating forests as warehouses instead of workshops. The medieval model understood that growing the tree was the first act of craftsmanship, not something that happened before the craft began. The good news is, once you see these patterns, you start making better choices at the lumberyard, at the salvage yard, and even in how you store and select stock for your projects. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I figured out after studying dozens of pieces of antique timber, and it's a simple way to evaluate any board you're considering buying. Look at the end grain. Count the growth rings in 1 inch of radius from the center of the board outward. If you're seeing 8 or more rings per inch, that wood grew slowly, probably under a canopy in conditions similar to what those medieval forests produced. The grain will be tight, the wood will be dense, and it'll work beautifully under hand tools if you're seeing if you're 4 rings per inch. That tree grew fast, probably on a plantation with plenty of sun and fertilizer. It'll be lighter, more porous, and more prone to movement. I started checking this at my local lumberyard, and I was amazed at the variation even within the same species and the same stack. 2 boards of white oak sitting right next to each other, one with 12 rings per inch and one with 3. I grabbed the slow-grown one, took it home, and the difference when I put a plane to it was night and day. Smooth, consistent, almost waxy under the blade. That one simple check, counting rings per inch on the end grain, has changed how I buy lumber more than anything else I've learned in 40 years of woodworking. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Lost Workshop. 17 chapters of medieval hand tool techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with 33 illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one. See.